Good morning.
Good morning, Penny.
My Lord. Morning, huh?
My Lord, what a morning. Oh, what a morning.
I guess. Well,
we had a lot of streams going out at once, apparently. So
I was going to say we got the sermon.
Yep, I know. That was from my phone.
Oh. Seriously?
So, yeah.
I was wondering why it was so funny. I'm like, the sanctuary is reversed.
I know, yeah, because it does that weird mirroring thing. Yeah. I know. It was like, how did this get? Yeah, it was weird. We did our best. We'll stitch back together something that will include the music and we'll show later, but
I'm sure you guys will.
And I have no idea how it went out at the drive-in either. So we'll see.
Well, hopefully she got out there in time.
I know, that's what, like, it was all about timing once we kind of got things like when the computer crashed and then we were kind of juggling what we were going to do next, and we went just right for just do the sermon, and then we'll come back later and record the music.
Yeah,
We had Robin Kane in there. Good morning, Lori.
Good morning, Lori.
Hey.
I'm just looking at my email. I got your biography. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to see if I can send that out here to the crowd.
All right.
The books and such.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. I loved your note how you'd love to come back in person.
Yeah.
We've got because the other thing we really didn't get a chance to dig into yet either is the whole interfaith element. And really, I mean, that seems like one of the hints at what Bonhoeffer is kind of could be another way to respond to white Christian nationalism too, or the variety of other effects as you go, into other partnerships and collaboration and people who are suffering.
Right. Yeah, and I think I've also it's in my past experience, it's interesting for Lutheran congregations to hear me talk about teaching now at a Lutheran institution that is so incredibly diverse religiously.
Yeah.
And so I can connect the Bonhoeffer stuff and kind of the classroom lived experience of,
so many of the students, who have varying, way different backgrounds. Yeah.
Well, and that's exciting to hear, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful. And I think, we've been kind of on the forefront of the conversations in the network of ELCA colleges and universities talking about being both rooted and open, so that we're still very committed. There's a commitment there, but then what is that? How do you invite others into that, into thinking about their own commitments? So,
yeah.
Well, I heard from Ann Wolf. She said she might not be here today, but she ordered the Armchair Theologian for herself, and then
John Wayne and John Wayne
one. And I'm like, I replied to her, I said, is there perchance a study group in the future?
Yeah. That seems like that could be the Jesus and John Wayne one too. And when did the Armchair Theologian, when did that come out, Lori?
That came out in 2009.
Okay. Yeah.
Well,
that was another, like, are there things in there that you'd want to include now? That, yeah.
Oh yeah, I would. I think it's a good start. I think it's basic.
Yeah,
I think
still a good starting point.
Yeah, I think I keep learning. It's one of those things where, like, I want to go back and redo everything I've ever read in every class that we're taking. So it's like, oh my gosh, like, all these dots are connecting now in different ways. I'm like, So
you're gonna get another doctorate. Yeah.
Yeah, actually.
Just for the fun of it.
I definitely think about going back to seminary sometimes, both in my wildest dreams and my worst nightmares.
Yeah. I think no matter what deadlines I have, I have this whole list of, like,
Yeah.
This right now is like just all my, like, I don't know if you can see, like, not Augsburg related stuff. This is just my list of other stuff that I'm working on. And it doesn't matter what deadlines I have, nothing is the same pressure as an unfinished dissertation.
That just hangs over your head.
That hangs, yeah. And then I did kind of my sort of life story kind of got, I did kids and
right, all intermingled.
Yeah, so it was a
long journey.
You think doing dissertations while having children is easy?
There are no perfect times to do anything.
No,
that's the thing. There's no right way to do it or wrong way to do it.
Sometimes it lines up better than other times, but rarely just works out.
I did finish writing the summer after my second son was born, so I can hold a baby and type. I can just tell you that.
That's a skill. That's That's awesome.
I was listening to. I was doing errands yesterday, and I was listening to a new show on NPR called Hidden Brain.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen ads for that. I haven't.
Okay, so yesterday's show.
Is that Shanta Vedantam? Is that the?
Yes.
Yeah.
And yesterday's show,
really cool.
He was talking about. He was interviewing something. Like I said, I'm traveling, so I'm getting snippets here and there, and I have to go back and listen to it because the discussion was at one point how. We like to tell ourselves a story that fits so that we don't have to have any more responsibilities. And that if we tell ourselves a story that, well, it's their fault. And he was talking about race and other things like that, that then we're off the hook of doing what we should be doing as people in community. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Click. I'm like, we were talking about this.
Yeah.
That whole idea of, and they even were kind of leading toward the whole idea of inaction is still an action.
Yeah.
Not doing anything is still an action.
Silence is still a response. Yeah.
Yeah. And right. And that whole business, and with the discussion we had last week about, if I do nothing, I'm guilty. And if I do something, I'm guilty. So which way am I going to go? And it was just very interesting. And I haven't had a chance to listen to it since, but yeah, really an interesting conversation on yesterday's show. I texted my husband, he said, there's just too much good stuff to listen to.
Yeah, it's hard between the and there's so many resources, now between books and audiobooks and podcasts and YouTube, and it's like and webinars and it's just like I can't keep up with all of it. So
and you need kind of what I'm waiting for is my personal AI curator who will tell me the kinds of things that are going to be most helpful for me to listen to next.
That's a slippery slope, Peter.
Not if I program it. What's slippery about it?
Well, having someone in charge of telling you what is good and not good for you to watch. That's the first step.
What if I tell it that I want, a diverse set of voices? What if I tell it that I want, a wide ranging, it's all, computers don't just force you to do things. You have to still tell them what to do.
That's true. That's true.
I tell Alexa a lot of what to do, but mostly she's not that smart yet. She's working on it. Or they're working on it. I'm not really sure about what Alexa's preferred pronouns are. But
you can decide.
I know I haven't gotten I haven't gotten into some other voices yet. Recording who's you want.
Chris's person now is from Australia.
Sure. Okay. I'm gonna
You
get.
know,
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, but it's kind of fun.
How are the Hagans? How are the Boyds? Did you guys get any of the ripple effects where you are down south of the cold? Still can't hear you, Ron. I don't know why. We had a crate this morning. We had our main worship computer crashed during live streaming, and so we unfortunately, it basically went. It just didn't work, and so we cut just the sermon in, and then now we have to go back and stitch together the rest of the recording, and it's not fun. Technology is, I'm about at my last of, I just want it to work, and it's just like a car. You have to keep on maintaining it and doing new things. And
well, it was interesting because it was kind of like, well, it just stopped, and I'm like, well,
so well.
yeah. So yeah, it'll.
Sometimes Ron and Kathy, sometimes I change that. Can you select a different microphone from your little, you trying that? I'm sure you're trying that. Yeah. I'm going to also make both Penny and Lori co-hosts again here. So you can have power beyond your wildest dreams.
Right.
I suspect that we're going to have a number of people that will probably be late or watching this later on because of the drive-in being open today.
Yep.
Oh, got it.
So we also have the first service was kind of botched, and hopefully we don't know what's going on outside right now. We'll see if how that one goes.
Well, why wouldn't that one go okay?
I know, it's not like it's snowing or anything, or is it? It's
not here.
It was earlier.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
A little couple flakes. Nothing much.
Well, Hannah and I still made up communion.
You did? Good.
Yeah. Hannah, my dog, we have graham crackers.
She's communing.
She communes with me every Sunday morning, yes.
All of creation is groaning for the redemption. For a little graham cracker treat. Good morning, Marie.
Can you guys hear me yet?
Yeah.
Yay!
We got you. Okay,
Major
now
successes.
we do. Yeah, you got your headset now and everything.
Yeah. Well, Kathy can't hear this now. Okay.
I do want the weather report though.
Oh, the weather report.
We're not prepared for that.
Did you guys have any rough freezing or anything? You're too far. Are you too far east?
Far west.
Too far
We're
west.
far west.
Okay.
We're south and west. We're west of Texas.
Yeah.
But we had some freezing temperatures.
You did?
But that's only because we're a mile high where we're at.
Oh.
Almost. And so we're dry, high and dry. We didn't get any of the snow or the super cold.
Yeah.
No. So we just barely got into the freezing temperatures.
It's crazy.
It's 48 degrees out here right now, and we have plenty of sunshine.
Ooh, nice.
Almost too much sunshine.
Never too much.
Kathy says, come on down. We have 2 extra rooms waiting for somebody. We've had a really slow year this year.
You usually have quite a few guests, huh?
Yeah, we do have quite a few.
Yeah, you're regularly hosting
I was gonna say, gee, I wonder why.
other snowbirds.
Well, it's not
Never,
because of the weather.
never, ever too much sunshine.
I know. I'm with you, Christy. I'm with you on that note.
Or Jeff and Christy been down here, so they know.
Bill, how are you doing?
Oh, you're muted, Bill. We can't hear you.
I know he looks comfortable though. That's the main thing.
Yes, he does. Okay. Hey,
Keep coming
Peter,
in.
we had a question for you.
For
There was
me,
mention, yeah, for you. There was
You have a-
mention this morning about, the book study, and people should sign up. Where do they sign up?
yeah,
Haven't seen a sign up anywhere.
didn't Marilee put that up?
I couldn't find it. And
me
Delcy called
see.
me yesterday and asked, I said, I'm not in charge of that part of things. So,
Yeah, let me see if what I thought we had decided with Marilee was to put up a little like a little sign up form on the website, but maybe that's going up this week.
okay, because I wasn't sure if we were supposed to start this week. It's kind of short notice.
Yeah, no, I don't think you need to start yet.
Okay. All right.
But
And
we
were
do
we-
need to get that out to people so that they can sign up.
And were we gonna get like kind of a plan of attack as
We do have that. Yep.
leaders? Okay,
Yep.
because we haven't gotten that either yet.
Kind of we've got a little discussion guide as well to go with it. But I think we're also just really up to the we're leaving it up to groups too to decide what exactly they want to chew on or what the their main focus or how many times they're going to meet.
Okay,
But
did you-
mostly it's around time. Mostly,
Oh.
which we do have that up, and that should be all set. for
okay,
you.
because I couldn't find it. So either I'm,
No, you're a good researcher, so if you can't find it, I doubt anybody else can find it. But I'll talk to Marilee and see if we can. Get
Okay.
that moving.
that sounds good.
Yeah.
Because
That's my-
Delcy was like,
it's mostly the technical. I think we have all the information that we need. Now it's just kind of the technical
Okay.
stuff of getting it where and out. I know it's going
Okay.
to go in the Trinity today too, which should be out this week, the beginning of this week. So
Okay.
that should have kind of a nice big plug too for it.
okay, because it was like, well, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Which are all those are good responses. Those are all good. Those are all good wonderings.
If you ever need a question, if you're out of questions, just call me.
You've got a couple to spare. You've got a
Just a
couple
few,
to
just-
spare.
Just a few, so, or anyone in this group, you could probably call, if
Yeah,
you're short of questions.
Exactly.
Yes.
But the question is, do you have any answers?
Oh, he'll have an answer. It might be,
Who is-
that's a good
Who is
question.
he? That's a good question. Ron, sometimes we just make the road by walking it, That's a good Brian McLarenism. Or I don't know who came up with that. Probably someone way before Brian McLaren.
But that is a good one. Whoever came up with it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, didn't somebody say something about questions are cheap and the answers are expensive
That's
or
right.
are hard to find? Something like that?
Exactly.
But you have to have a question if you're going to, to look forward, if you just look at things and don't ever ask a question, you're not gonna get anywhere.
Spoken like a true engineer.
I was just going to say that's how science works. You got to have the question first, and then you start looking for the answer.
That's right.
Well, it's 5 after. So like I said, I thought the group might be a little smaller today because of drive-in. So we may have people, trickle in later on, and that is always okay. So so this means that with fewer people, we get to ask more questions, each of us. So there you go.
That's right.
All right, so I think we are all set to go. Lori, again, thank you so much for being back this week. I'm very excited to hear more about what you have to say about Bonhoeffer and how we can gain some additional understanding and learning from him and what his theology and how it might pertain to us today. So with that, go ahead.
Thank you. I am delighted to be back, and I appreciate all of you who came back. So thanks for coming back. For me, this has been it's a kind of special that I got to spend last week with you, Valentine's Day, and today is actually my birthday. So so thank you. Yes, so 2 special days.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. So I thought, so last week I was kind of walking through a narrative of Bonhoeffer's life, trying to kind of sprinkle in some key points, especially related to questions about why I think Bonhoeffer is relevant right now in this moment. But I also got some additional questions from both Peter and Penny over the week, sort of thinking about how we can think about how Bonhoeffer is relevant and maybe some broader brush strokes. So I kind of want to do a couple of things today. So I'm going to share my screen, and all right, can you see the slide that I have up? This is why is Bonhoeffer relevant today? Yes, everyone can see that? Penny, I can't hear you.
It just went to this line down the middle. It was
Yeah, it was there and then it was there and then gone. Maybe we'll
how about now?
Try that again. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I've got 2, again, technology, right? You were talking about your technology this morning. I've got 2 screens going, so I'm trying to, all right. So this is consistent with some things I said last week, but I want to just put this out here again as kind of a framework. I might go back to the sort of the end of my narrative just to kind of pick up those threads, but then I think we'll have more time today just for conversation and questions. And so again, this is very much from my point of view. If you talk to another Bonhoeffer scholar, you might get a different take on what to pull out from Bonhoeffer. But when I think about Bonhoeffer, I think about and his relevance for us. These are some things that come to my mind. So Bonhoeffer calls us to see the events of the world from below, from the perspective of the outcast, powerless, oppressed, from the perspective of those who suffer. He writes about this very explicitly toward the end of his life. So in the 1942-43, he's writing about this, and then it resonates with other things he writes while he's in prison. The second bullet point there, Bonhoeffer says that when I encounter an other, that other places an ethical demand on me to respond. So again, I introduced this idea last week when I was talking about the work he did in his dissertation and thinking about community and church and this idea of Christ existing as community. And so this is one way that you can sort of pull out this thinking. He says in that dissertation, he says that a person exists always and only in ethical responsibility toward another. So he's actually defining what it means to be human by the way we respond to other human beings. So for me, that's a really important thing. And that's a theme then that's going to get threaded all the way through his work and life and get developed in different ways, including the third bullet point. Bonhoeffer links his understanding of discipleship with his understanding of, we talked a little bit about this last time, vicarious representative action. And that his ideas, then, if you're familiar with his ideas of grace, costly grace, and what he calls ethics as formation, they're embedded here. So there's a lot, this bullet point has a lot, right, embedded in this. But discipleship, so again, if that book that you might be familiar with as The Cost of Discipleship, the original German title of that book is Nachfolge. Do I have any German speakers in the room? Anybody have a literal translation for Nachfolge? It literally means following after. So if you think about what it means to be a disciple, right, it means to follow after someone. And so actually in the new critical English editions, the title now is just Discipleship rather than The Cost of Discipleship. I think the earliest translators were trying to get that idea of costly grace, which is central to that book, into the title. So that's why you get The Cost of Discipleship. And so for him then to follow after Christ is to, like Christ, act vicariously on behalf of others. So if you think about what you might believe about the way Christ acted on behalf of humanity, on behalf of all people, that to follow after Christ is to do something similar, is to act on behalf of those, especially those who have lost their voice, their power, their privilege, right? So that you stand in their place. Now that gets complicated in our current conversation because you also don't want to assume that people on the margins don't have their own voice, right? So you have to be careful about paternalism and that kind of thing. So we can tease that out a little bit. And then I'll come back to this idea of ethics as formation, being formed after the image of Christ. That's a really deep, thick concept for him, but it's another way to sort of tie all these threads together. And then finally, he asks the question, who is Christ for us today? Which again, you can see the connections back to all of these other themes, because it's like when we encounter others, how do we see the face of Christ in others? And what I would like to propose is that if you take all of these things into account, then in terms of our sort of current situation, it allows us to imagine some things, right? What would it be like if we imagined political policy shaped by considering the needs of others as our responsibility, right? What would it look like if in our communities, if those who have power and privilege acted on behalf of those who did not, or made policies on behalf of those who did not, right? To sort of shift that into something more equitable. And then you can think about, what would it look like to recognize Christ in the face of immigrants, transgender youth, communities that have identities that just don't line up with your own identity. What does it look like to imagine the face of Christ in people who are different than you are, right? So I think those are ways that, so for me, that Bonhoeffer can help us in our current context. Is everybody with me so far? Yes, all right. I am just gonna, hold on one second. I wanna open the chat. Okay, I've got a chat window open, so if people have questions, you can certainly put something in the chat. So so what I'd like to do is I'd like to take about 15 minutes and just sort of finish the narrative that I started, because I think it ties, there's some things that I have sort of laid out that tie in with these big themes that I think I want you to sort of think about as a framework for listening. And then we can just open it up for a conversation and questions. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay. So I'm going to actually skip ahead now to where we left off. Sorry for the, here we go. We left off with, so Bonhoeffer had studied in New York. He had these really so if you weren't here with us last week, I apologize. I'm picking up in the middle of the story. If you were, I'll just remind you that we'd been talking about Bonhoeffer's time in New York, and he had these really profound he'd made really profound connections with certain friends, with his professor Reinhold Niebuhr, with the French pacifist Jean Lasserre, with the African-American student Albert Fisher. They were all sort of instrumental in Bonhoeffer's move toward thinking in ecumenical ways, right? So across, this was within the Christian tradition, but across sort of denominational affiliations and an international, thinking about internationalism, which then came to fruition when he went back to Germany. He became a youth secretary in both the World Alliance for Promoting International Friendship through the Churches, that's a mouthful, and also the Ecumenical Council for Practical Christianity. And so in those organizations, he traveled throughout Europe. He also lectured as a member of the theological faculty at Berlin University, and he served as a student chaplain, delivering sermons and teaching confirmation class in a working class neighborhood in Berlin. Remember, he had grown up with quite a bit of privilege. So now he's in this working class neighborhood in Berlin, lots of unemployment, lots of poverty. And he found himself moved by these people on the margins, far away from the masquerade of the quote unquote Christian world, right? So they're sort of living in real difficult circumstances. And so his work in the church, both in Berlin and in New York, influenced his academic study, his academic inquiry and teaching, so that his classes were filled with questions that weren't just speculation or abstract conjecture about theological, philosophical things, right? They were really urgent questions about life and faith. Eventually, again, leading him to that question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? Now, at the same time, in the 2 years that he, sort of prior to this, the National Socialists had been on the rise. His family was concerned about this. And so remember that Hitler came to power at the end of January of 1933. When I'm teaching, my students always forget, right? They always think, they think about the war, they think about what they know about the Holocaust, and they think late 30s, early 40s. But Hitler took power at the end of January 1933, and 2 days after that, Bonhoeffer delivered a radio address warning his fellow Germans that to make an idol of the Führer, the leader, that's what Führer means, leader, to make an idol of the leader is to make him a misleader. Moreover, that the leader must radically reject the temptation to become an idol, because that would be to sort of mistake what's ultimate and what's penultimate, what's eternal and what's of this world, right? And so he actually says those who make this misappropriation, who mistake the leader for an idol, will in the end be destroyed by him. Pretty prophetic words from Bonhoeffer really early on. And of course, if you remember the story within months, he starts opening concentration camps, and they pass the Aryan paragraph, which says anybody who has any Jewish ancestry can no longer hold a civil office. And then they decide to take the regional Landskirche, the sort of 28 Protestant denominations in Germany, and make a single state church, the Reich Church. And they do so under the leadership of Ludwig Müller. So here you have a picture of Hitler, you have a picture of Müller, you have Müller's installation as the Reich bishop in the summer of 1933, which one of Bonhoeffer's biographers describes Müller as Hitler's preening sycophant. So he was a Nazi sympathizer all the way. And what happened was that anybody who was a Christian, anybody who had confessed faith in Jesus, but had Jewish grandparents, Jewish ancestry, were basically expelled from the church, definitely expelled from the ministry. So any pastors in that situation, but it was about 350,000 people were expelled from the church. Bonhoeffer's attempts, there was a synod gathering where he tried to oppose the adoption because the church had adopted the Aryan paragraph similar to the civil adoption of it. And when Bonhoeffer tried to object to that, he was met with jeers and catcalls at the synod assembly. So he protested in a written statement you might be familiar with called The Church and the Jewish Question, where he says the church has the right and the responsibility to question the actions of the state. The church has the right and the responsibility to aid victims of the state, even if they're not Christian. And the church has the right and the responsibility, this is sort of the famous piece out of this, to jam the spokes of the wheel of the state if the state is creating too much or too little law and order. Yeah, Peter.
Just kind of a little aside on that too, because I think one of the things that the Reich really pulled from was some of Martin Luther's work too on the Jews. And so to respond to that and have a different Lutheran voice come through that came to a very different conclusion about what that role and responsibility is, I think is really important. And a real powerful development.
Right, and he was still, so Luther had talked about the relationship of the church and the state. You might be familiar with the two kingdoms language, right? Where the church and the state have different sources of authority and different spheres of responsibility. And Bonhoeffer abided by that, right? Mm-hmm. But as you say, Luther had kind of, at the end of his life, was horribly anti-Semitic, and the Nazis used that to their advantage to sort of support their position. And Bonhoeffer was saying the church actually does have the right and responsibility to take action when the state's not doing its job, when it's not functioning properly. Now, this is not a call to violent action necessarily, right? This could be nonviolent civil disobedience. But he certainly is saying that the church needs to, when the state's not doing its job and it's not functioning correctly, the church can seize the wheel, can stop the wheel, and needs to do this. This was really controversial. He delivered this essay as an address to other pastors who got up and left. They walked out of the room, right? They weren't ready to hear this. And so, but for him, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's just that kind of brings to mind too a very kind of somewhat similar address to the clergy and from a Birmingham jail that Martin Luther King gave too. That was, very similar kind of spoke in the wheel moment delivered to the leadership of the church during, obviously a very different moment, but.
No, but there's a lot of resonance there. Including the idea that, which I think I introduced last time, was that Bonhoeffer was saying, we are responsible for the coming generations, that our theology has to be about sort of living in this moment, in the sufferings, joys, sorrows, perplexities, questions of this world. If the day of judgment comes, tomorrow, fine, I'll stop working. But otherwise, I have to work for a better future. Martin Luther King Jr. is doing the same kind of thing, because he's saying we have a responsibility born out of our Christian faith to take action and responsibility right now for what's going on. Because there were lots of and it's really easy to see in the civil rights era, there were lots of preachers who were saying things like, I'm thinking in particular of a Baptist preacher in Jackson, Mississippi, Douglas Hudgens, who preached this message of purity and personal salvation. He's like, you just need to focus on your own sort of relationship with Jesus, and you don't have any responsibility for what's going on around you. And so there were other people, Martin Luther King Jr., Ed King, a white Methodist preacher, other African-American preachers saying, no, actually, part of the call, part of the discipleship, right? This goes back to Bonhoeffer's notion of discipleship, to follow after, is to actually take responsibility for others in the world, that it is our responsibility to act. So yeah, I think sometimes making those comparisons is actually quite helpful. And it becomes so in this case where the church, the state church, the Reich Church had adopted this position, this Aryan paragraph, sort of expulsion of anybody with Jewish ancestry, a purity, right? This is a purity type of language, right? Bonhoeffer said this is what he called a status confessionis. Here, I'll type that. Status. Can't type when I'm under pressure. Status confessionis, right? A state of confession, that this position in his mind is contrary to the gospel, and therefore requires attention, right? You have to act on this. And so he, along with Martin Niemöller, you may be familiar with Martin Niemöller, they formed, along with a lot of others, the Emergency Pastors League in a response to all of this that was going on. Eventually, they wrote the Bethel Confession. Eventually, this group wrote the Barmen Declaration. They created the Confessing Church, which was a breakoff church. And I mean, interestingly, I mean, this gets into a lot of complicated history that I won't get into. But so Bonhoeffer helped draft the Bethel Confession in response to what was happening in the state church. But by the time it got edited, it got watered down. He actually refused to sign it. So he decided he needed to take kind of what he called a retreat to the wilderness, which meant taking 2 German-speaking churches in London. So he left for London in October of 1933 because he just wasn't sure what his role was, right? What he was supposed to be doing. He hoped to kind of go work unobtrusively in London while paying attention to what was happening in Germany. But you know, he was still quite active. He was still very busy. You know, at the same time, you have people in the Reich Church, somebody like Reinhold Krause, who was a leader in the Reich Church, saying, when we draw from the gospel that which speaks to our German hearts, then the essentials of the teachings of Jesus emerge clearly and revealingly, coinciding completely with the demands of National Socialism, and we can be proud of that. So again, this is where he's fighting against this notion that somehow in their case, German identity and Christian identity are completely identical, and that somehow that's what you need to pursue. Bonhoeffer rather preached that Christians should read the Bible not only for ourselves, but also against ourselves, to know and love the world in which we actually live, one filled with struggle, poverty, and uncertainty. So again, he remained active in the ecumenical movement and was discussing developments in Germany with other ecumenical leaders like Bishop George Bell in London. And then he went to an ecumenical conference in the summer of 1934, where he insisted that we are faced with a decision, either National Socialist or Christian. You can't be both. And he issued this call to peace, noting that peace is not reached by a path of security, but only with risk. He said, the hour is late, the world is choked with weapons, and dreadful is the distrust which looks out of all men's eyes. The trumpets of war may blow tomorrow, for what are we waiting? There's a sermon he preached in London in 1934. The date's a little unclear. And he says in that sermon, Christianity stands or falls with its revolutionary protest against violence, arbitrariness, and pride of power, and with its plea for the weak. So again, that theme of seeing the event of the events of the world from below really becomes critical. This passage just came to my attention recently. It's not a really famous passage of Bonhoeffer's. But I was doing a little bit of research because I liked it so much. I was like, well, so where does this come from? And it turns out that when the Emergency Pastors League was meeting, they had one of their meetings at this place in Bielefeld, Germany, which was a hospital for people with mental and physical disabilities. And so Bonhoeffer had been struck by the vulnerability of the people there, especially in the context of Nazi Germany, right? Because it wasn't just Jews who were being deported to the camps. It was people with other, I would say, quote unquote, ailments, right? Who were considered other and were othered by the Nazis. And he was really struck by their vulnerability. He also he wrote about their, what he imagined to be their better insight into certain realities of human existence. Again, when you have a certain point of view, you can bring something to the table in a different way. And so almost a year later, when he was in London, he arranged for his congregation to send money to this facility. And what strikes me is that his concern for these people it had stuck with him, right? Almost a year later, that this idea, this sort of lingering concern for the other, and that call, right? That call to respond, that the other places an ethical demand on me. And I think this is going to sort of point us to what he starts writing about at the end of his life in prison, where he says, human religiosity, right? Human sort of compulsion to be religious directs people in need to the power of God in the world, toward a false concept of God, of sort of God as Deus ex machina, right? This idea that God kind of comes in and fixes your problems when you have a problem and then is kind of out of the picture for the rest of the time. He says instead, Bonhoeffer says, the Bible directs people toward the powerlessness and the suffering of God. Only the suffering God can help. And so this is like a shift in perspective. Goes on to say that he will go on to say is the starting point for what he says is a worldly interpretation of Christianity. So Penny, I see that you put a question in the, do you want to jump in now with a different question?
Actually, and then John has his hand up too. I think he put a question in there as well. John Bootner. Do you see it in the chat?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Laurie. Hitler and Germany in World War II has been of great interest to me all my life, because my mom lived through French-occupied or German-occupied France during the war. And by the way, it ruined her whole life. She didn't trust people. She was always believed she was a victim. I mean, and I know what it's like to hear someone you love cry for their mom just before she's dying. I know what that's like, because in her last day of living, she was crying for her mother. But we talked about that all her life, and she had a hard time dealing with it. But one of the things that scared her the most was the quiet that happened when she was living outside the city of Paris, and for most of it, and then Strasbourg towards the end of the war. And she said the hardest thing was the fear there was, and the odd quiet. And when she went to church, they never talked about anything related to love or judgmentalism or being fair or anything like that. They talked about the Bible and Gospels and what have you. And what I gathered from my talking with my mom, she lived to be 92 years old, was she was surprised at the tremendous quiet, that nobody said anything. Everybody's views were their own. But at the pulpit, the priest never said anything about treating Jewish people nicely. And we're talking about, and when she was in Strasbourg, she went to church at the cathedral there, and there was a bishop and an archbishop there. And I think that is very, very similar to what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years, that while we don't have to be quiet, there was a tremendous amount of quiet by virtually all religious orders, except perhaps the religious right, the evangelical right. They were not quiet. And I wonder if you could comment about what happens when you do nothing. Is that a sin? Obviously, when you do something, that's an action. But what if you do nothing? And I see a lot of similarities between what happened in the last 5 years. Not that we're close to what happened in Germany in World War II, and I tell you, we're not. But there's a lot of similarities, and they're eerie, especially the quiet. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important point, and I think you can make again, we can connect some dots. So you've just described what was happening in Europe in this time period. If we go back to Peter's comment about Martin Luther King Jr. and especially the letter from Birmingham jail, King says that the real danger from his point of view to the civil rights movement is not the most violent white supremacist, it's the moderate white church, it's the moderate whites who aren't saying anything, who aren't and you can see how it's the complicity and the silence of people sort of in the middle who actually open the door for this sort of more radical violent extremists. You can see that over and over again in the 1960s. And I think you're right to say that this is where we're at now. So that we can look with horror at the people who are the most blatant racist or the most blatant xenophobic sort of hate mongers, around, whether it's around immigration or whether around people of color, or whatever the category is. We can sort of say, oh, those folks are being horrible. But if the people who support, the people who are in the middle, don't speak out, it allows those voices to continue to rise up. And so without putting Peter in an awkward situation, I've read a number of things that a lot of articles that say, if your pastor is not talking about Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ rights and those things from the pulpit, then you need to look for another community that's going to sort of raise those issues up as matters that are maybe to some degree, in Bonhoeffer's words, a state of confession, right? Is it, to what degree does it come to that level? I mean, that's a bigger question about which things rise to that level, but that, it's like his time at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in 1930, where he saw the people there, the pastor there, connecting what was happening in the world with their understanding and preaching of the gospel. So to understand what it means to be free, right? Free for others, free for neighbors through the salvific act of Christ. That actually means paying attention to people at that time, people being lynched, people being kicked out of places of business and that kind of thing based on nothing but their racial identity. So I think you're right. I think there is this notion that silence places you on the side of the oppressor. And so, and it's tricky and it's hard because sometimes speaking out can be scary. I'll just say it that way. I hope that addresses your question a little bit.
Very nicely, Laurie. Thank you very much.
Penny, did you want to? I see that you had a question in the.
Yeah, it had to do with we've been talking a lot about some of his main themes that are really very interesting and eye-opening for me. And I'm just wondering, in his writings, does he refer to, are there certain passages within the Bible that really seem to have drawn him to this, or is it coming more from life experience, or just what do you see in his writings that bring him to some of these conclusions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've never never thought about it quite like that. I mean, I think it's both. He certainly read the Bible. He read the Bible daily, and was drawn to the Psalms, but he also was drawn to the story. I mean, again, I think where you get some of the powerful theological work that he's doing toward the end of his life really is just the story of Jesus coming into the world as an infant, sort of winning space and power through his weakness, actually through his vulnerability. And so in those stories, you get the foundation, if you will, of some of his most I think profound theological insights. That's not there's probably ways I could probably pull out some specific passages. Those aren't on the tip of my tongue, but that would be my initial answer.
Well, I think last week you did mention something about, was it Lasar, who had said to him he needs to look at the Sermon on the Mount differently?
For sure.
Then the other thing that is new for me is this idea of God's suffering.
Mm-hmm.
what do you mean he's in charge, you know? But that whole concept of what does it even mean when we say God's suffering? Well, God suffers in his people, in us. And so it's just putting a really different way of looking at all of this for me, giving me a lot to think about. So that's why I kind of went to that and like, well, how is he coming to this? What's his thought process through all of it? So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think let me just.
Can I make one point real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Just about the suffering God piece, which you're going to get actually a number of theologians out of the experience of World War II and a lot of this. Miroslav Volf is another one who is going to really take on the crucified God in a different way and really connect. I mean, this is somewhat Elie Wiesel as well, really connecting the dots of where is God in this to suffering. But I think you have other folks too who are going to connect that actually the idea of a suffering God begins way earlier than Jesus too, that and you have all of these stories of God suffering alongside of God's people for a very long time before Jesus too. And then it's going to kind of continue to, unfortunately, in our lived experience in those times too. But and Terry Fretheim, who is also a Luther professor, has written a lot on this. Both a professor of Pastor Chris's and mine. But I think that's a really important concept to pull from Bonhoeffer. It's this idea of God suffering, not God the vending machine. God the universal vending machine where you put in your goods and you put in your cash, your blessings back.
Yeah.
Could I add something to that, please?
Yes.
Yeah, if we believe in the concept of God the Father, and I do, and I'm a father as well. I'm also a grandfather. When one of your children are being victimized, you feel their pain. Sometimes you feel their pain more than they do. But when one of your children victimizes someone else, you also feel their pain. I think in some cases that's a worse pain because you feel responsible for what they do. And so the concept of a suffering God is a concept of a father. I don't think it's any more complicated than that, or a mother.
Interesting. I think this might be a nice time to sort of tease out a little bit more about what he says about costly grace. And so in Discipleship, he writes about this concept of grace, and as Lutherans, I think you're probably familiar with this idea. So, if the brief recap of Luther's life was that Luther, Luther was a Catholic, he was a monk, and he was tormented by this notion of what it meant to be righteous, or what it meant to be justified in the eyes of God. So he went to confession every day, even though he lived a pretty straight and narrow life, to the point that his confessor said, you're wasting our time. Please don't come back. Right? I don't have time for this. And so, Luther went off and studied. He studied the scripture. He prayed. Because he was so caught up in this passage that said, "The righteous shall live by faith." He thought you had to be righteous before you could live by faith. And of course, the conclusion he reached was that righteousness, that being lined up in the eyes of God, was a gift of unmerited mercy and forgiveness. That's grace, right? So this is where we are justified by grace through faith alone. So you just you accept it, and it's yours. Now, this is different from the classical sort of Catholic. So this is called the declarative doctrine of the justification. You declare your faith and you are justified, right? That's the Lutheran doctrine. The transformative doctrine of justification, which comes out of St. Augustine and the Catholic tradition, says that, yeah, grace is a gift from God, but it's one that transforms your thinking, your willing and believing so that you can act in such a way as to be right with God. And of course, this comes out of Augustine's biography. He converted late in life. He lived a pretty wild and exciting life, right? That would be the case for somebody who wrote a famous book called Confessions, right? If you don't have something to confess, you can't publish a long book called Confession. And so when he converted, he had to change the way he was living, right? He had to make some changes. So that gift of God, that gift of grace from God for him changed his thinking, willing, and believing so that he could act in such a way as to be justified. So if you take a look at these two doctrines, and think about what you know, if you're going to criticize one or the other, you kind of have to push them to their extremes to criticize them. So if you're criticizing the transformative doctrine of justification, what would be that critique? Have you, what would you think?
That it's doing works that's going to get you there.
It's works righteousness, right? That you have to earn your own salvation. So that's the critique there. But if you're standing in that position and you're critiquing the Lutheran declarative form, what's the critique on that side?
I don't have to do anything.
Nothing.
Don't have to change. I can be my nasty self.
That's right, because all you have
Good
to
to
do
go.
is just go back and declare your faith and you're all good to go. And it's so you're lazy, you're off the hook. Yeah, Peter, you want to jump in? No, I thought you were raising your hand. You're just like,
No,
amen.
I'm just amen. Yep.
Amen. Okay. So Bonhoeffer comes along out of the Lutheran tradition. He takes that Lutheran position as a starting point. He says that we are justified by faith by grace through faith alone. That's a starting point. He says, but we got to take this transformation piece a little bit more seriously, right? Like Paul said, works without faith, faith without works is dead. And Augustine had something to say about that. He said, so we have to recognize that this gift cost, this goes back to your point, John, cost God everything, right? It was costly for God, for his son to be sacrificed on the cross on our behalf, right? So it has to cost you something. There has to be some transformation. So he articulated this notion of costly grace, which kind of bridges the gap between these two doctrines. And of course it lines up, interestingly, right? It lines up with the 1989, a joint declaration on the doctrine of justification that the Lutheran World Federation and the Catholic Church issued, saying, hey, we've been fighting about this for a long time, but we're not that far apart. So they issued this joint declaration. And I think that articulation is really close to Bonhoeffer's description of costly grace. But I think this is another place. So Penny, I'm trying to connect the dots here. I think this is another place where that understanding of suffering, which then gets tied up with a Lutheran understanding of the theology of the cross and what that looks like, how, in the world, what it costs you to sort of focus on the suffering God rather than the triumphalist vision of God. I think it sort of brings this question of suffering back to the fore. Yeah, so I think that's a way to make those connections.
I see another question from another John.
Another John. Yeah, I think how would Bonhoeffer view the tremendous political division we have between people in the US and how we treat each other? Well, he would be mortified, I think, as we should all be mortified a little bit. But I think, given his own context, not entirely surprised, right? This is where this is where I think this question. So I'll say in a I don't want to oversimplify this, but in a maybe in an oversimplified way, this gets down to a question between misplaced certainty and what I'm going to call epistemological humility. So epistemology is that field of study about knowing. What do we know? How do we know it? It's the study of knowledge, right? What are our truth claims? And actually coming out of the Lutheran tradition, again, Luther weighs in here, and then Bonhoeffer echoes this, is that that we have to be epistemologically humble. We have to have humility, right? So that we are limited by all sorts of things, our historical context, for example, our geographical location, all the things that, that we have these sort of limited points of view. And the reality is that we don't have complete claims. We can't claim truth completely. And so that's exciting though, because it opens us up to interacting with others and sort of being open to learning, and whether that's across political understandings, religious identities, other kinds of cultural worldviews. It gives us room to both claim and hold on to our own commitments at the same time that we encounter people who have different understandings of the world. Yeah, Peter.
I think, and you might get to this too, but I think the idea that Bonhoeffer, had the opportunity to leave Germany too in its most polarized moment, and chose to go back, and was sailing, got on the last ship back to Germany, to be a part of the whatever the resolution. Yeah, you're there. See, yeah. But I think that's a really helpful reminder for me too, in the need for our continued engagement and our continued persistence and maybe perseverance through the polarization that we're in.
Yeah, and so I think, this is where, boy, this goes off in all sorts of directions in my head, right? But this is where part of the trouble with people who claim to have the truth and hold that truth, whether it's religious truth or political truth exclusively, is then it shuts out any actual dialogue. And it demonizes people who have different experiences, different views, different identities, right? So then all of those, so then you get this sort of narrowing of what it means to be, so fill in the blank, what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a patriot, right? You get this really narrow sort of view of that, and all of these other folks then become excluded and then often scapegoated, right? So that the problems are not only the problems then sometimes are actually not only they're caused by some of those other folks, right? So it's a convenient way to sort of point the finger. And so I think Bonhoeffer was trying to kind of open up this, and he moved, because in some ways he still writes and functions very much as a Christian with exclusive Christian claims, right? He was not, for example, an interfaith activist. And yet I think he was moving in the direction where his ethical thinking allows us to start thinking about what that would look like. So at the end of his life, he was writing fiction from prison. And he wrote, he wrote in one of his highly autobiographical pieces, right? One of the characters wrote, "For me, the main issue for individuals and for peoples is whether or not they have learned to live with other human beings and peoples. That's more important to me than all their ideas, thoughts, and convictions." And so back to your question about how would Bonhoeffer view this division, he would say, well, we haven't learned how to live with other human beings and peoples. We haven't learned that. And we've gotten so caught up in sort of butting heads over ideologies that we've ignored the sort of, what does it mean to sort of be in community with each other and recognize each other, in his words, as Christ, right? How do we fail to see each other as Christ? And I think he does that in a way that allows him to sort of invite that conversation, again, from his own commitments. He doesn't have to stop being a Christian to be engaged with people in their own, with their own particular commitments that might be different, right? So this is where, so I'm moving and sort of reading him. Again, he doesn't quite get there, but I would like to read him in line with somebody like Diana Eck, who's the director of the Pluralism Project at Harvard, who talks a lot about what she calls committed pluralism. so that you can hold your commitments and beliefs firmly at the same time you engage openly with people who have different points of view. And there's no sense, your goal in that interaction is not to convert one another, not to change the other's mind, but to learn from one each other, and then to be in community and to be in relationship. So I might have gone a little bit around the barn on that answer, but I hope that addressed the good question.
So just to kind of be cautionary here, we probably have about 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
I know we could go for much longer, but so I didn't know where you wanted to go from here.
Yeah, let me just read one more thing, and then we'll just finish with questions. So I'm just gonna, oh, look, there's a picture of Bonhoeffer's study, and there's a picture of me from about 15 years ago sitting at his study in Berlin. All right. Sorry, I missed my slide I'm looking for. Here it is, right here. Okay. So this comes from his ethics. And I think this is a really helpful sort of cap on some of the things we're talking about, right? So he says, Christ was not essentially a teacher, a lawgiver, but human being, a real human being like us. Accordingly, Christ does not want us to be, first of all, pupils, representatives, and advocates of a particular doctrine, but human beings, real human beings before God. Christ did not, like an ethicist, love a theory about the good. He loved real people. Christ was not interested like a philosopher in what is generally valid, but in that which serves real concrete human beings. Christ was not concerned whether the maxim of an action could become a principle of universal law, but whether my action now helps my neighbor to be a human being before God. God did not become an idea, a principle, a program, a universally valid belief or a law. God became human. So for me, that goes a long way in sort of pulling together some of these threads about what he was about. And in some ways, Penny, it goes back to your earlier question about, biblical connections. I think about Jesus sort of eschewing some of the laws of the time about the Sabbath, right? You're not supposed to help people on the Sabbath because it's work, and he's like, yeah, I'm more interested in helping my neighbor than following this sort of arbitrary law. So I'm going to do this thing instead. I'm going to help, I'm going to help get the mule out of the ditch or whatever the case might be. That's probably not biblical, but right. I think so. I think for me, this is where Bonhoeffer can be really helpful, and sometimes not helpful, because you still look out around. You still look out in the community and say, so what is it I'm supposed to do now? Like it still raises a lot of questions, and there's still a lot of discernment, right? Because he actually says for him, ethics is not the ethical question is not what does it mean to do good? The ethical question is, what is the will of God? And so that still raises all sorts of questions about how you know that you landed on it.
He, and also kind of goes to the point of the incompleteness of his life too. And that you're asking a lot of somebody who didn't get to the point in maybe his life where he could have explored those things more fully.
Yeah, that's a great point. Even like his ethics, when he wrote Ethics, which he intended to be kind of his magnum opus, it was fragmentary, so it was published posthumously. So after he died, friends tried to put together the pieces, and they argued about which order they went in, and he didn't have a chance to fully articulate all of his thoughts, and we're not sure where he would have landed. So
are there any other people who haven't had a chance to ask a question, have a question? Feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead. I suspect there are others. I know that there was a question brought up about the whole idea of evangelical, or the Boyds. Did you have a question?
Yeah, Lori, I'm wondering, what would Bonhoeffer have done after the war if he had lived?
that is such a hard, so as Peter was suggesting, he in 1939, after he directed a seminary for 2 years. It was an illegal seminary of the Confessing Church. It was closed by the Gestapo in 1937. He had all kinds of restrictions on him because he had been an outspoken opponent of the Nazis. He had restrictions about publishing and speaking and teaching. And so he really had limited options. He went back to New York in the summer in June of 1939, had everything in order to stay. He could have stayed in safety for the duration of the war. The war hadn't quite started yet, but he never felt settled. He felt like if he was going to be part of what he called the reconstruction of both Germany and Christendom after the crisis, part of it with his family and his friends. So he went back. He stayed only for a month, and in July of 1939, he went back on.
We've had a lot of technical difficulties today. It wouldn't surprise me if her internet went out too, but we'll see if she comes back.
Yeah, sometimes they do.
Yep. Oh, you're back.
Oh, hi. Sorry, everybody froze. I don't know what you
You froze. Yeah, unfortunately.
You froze. Go
I
ahead.
didn't have a funny
So
look
in
on my face.
1939, he came back.
So he went to New York. He could have stayed safely, but he wanted to be part of the reconstruction of Germany and Christendom after the crisis. So he went back on that last ship before they closed the Atlantic crossing. It's really hard to know. People like to speculate what he would have done, how he would have contributed, if he would have made a bigger impact had he lived. It's so just so hard to know those things.
I didn't know he did. I could totally forgot about the fiction writing. He wrote poetry. There's all kinds of other elements of his kind of contributions that are really tough to.
Yeah, he had one of the fragments in his prison writings was called it's an outline of a book that he was working on that was extremely promising. I think he would have continued to write and publish. Part of what we the scholars in the Bonhoeffer Society try to do now, right, is instead of trying to speculate about what he would have said about something, we are trying to do what we call think alongside him. So think constructively. So use what he did say, take up the issues that we're concerned with, and then use him constructively to talk about that. So in the book that I edited this last year, we have a middle section it's a constructive theology section. So I write about interfaith work. One of my colleagues writes about climate crisis. Two of my friends wrote together about mass incarceration. They both have taught in prison theology certificate programs, and so they have a lot of insight into that. Another person wrote about gender issues, and finally, one of the fifth chapter in that section is about the Confederate monument debate, but larger racial justice issues. And again, using things that Bonhoeffer did say to think creatively about what we want to say, but it's not quite the same thing as speculating. So I don't know if that helps, but we're trying to be responsible stewards of his legacy without putting words in his mouth.
Are there other contemporaries of Bonhoeffer? I mean, that kind of that are also helpful in that work, that are other kind of conversation partners. Obviously, Eberhard Bethke too is a big one, but
so Eberhard Bethke became his best friend. He was one of the seminarians at Finkenwalde. That's where he met him. He became his sort of, like I said, his best friend, his biographer. And then Eberhard married his niece, Renata. So there was a family connection too. And Eberhard and Renata really are the ones who were responsible for kind of stewarding his work into the public, right? But Bethke was a theologian in his own right. And did shape his legacy in certain ways. So there's a scholarship coming out now in the last 5 years about Eberhard, and both looking at what he offered and looking about the ways that he interpreted Bonhoeffer that may be a reflection of his own thinking in as much as they're reflections of Bonhoeffer. So I think that's one interesting sort of field of scholarship. you know, there certainly are other, there are other thinkers. I can't think of anybody who quite parallels Bonhoeffer in the same way in terms of that school of thought or that thinking. I mean, you can read, you know, you can read Karl Barth and sort of the relationship between Barth and Bonhoeffer and how that played out. But,
That's good.
Anyone else have a question?
Penny, just one other question. Who's the Bonhoeffer of today?
That's a complicated question. So let me, you know, there's I think I sent Penny a bibliography that she's going to share, and I'm just going to pull it up on my computer to make sure that
It should have gotten to you guys. I think I finally had success in sending it. So
yeah, so the resource that I would highly recommend, super interesting book, is by Stephen Haynes. It's called The Battle for Bonhoeffer, Debating Discipleship in the Age of Trump. And Steve is a good friend of mine. He and I co-wrote the Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians book. And he has written other books on Bonhoeffer's legacy and sort of reception. And what he does in The Battle for Bonhoeffer is he lays out all the different kind of groups or ways that people use and employ Bonhoeffer, and explains it in really engaging and simple, like not simple, but like accessible ways. In fact, I think I sat down and read the book like over the course of one day, which, I mean, I'm also a total geek and, like, you know, couldn't put it down. But so he tracks both scholarship, he tracks different interpretations of Bonhoeffer, and he tracks sort of popular uses of Bonhoeffer. So he has some really interesting anecdotes about ways that you know, there's a coffee shop in New Hampshire called the Bonhoeffer Cafe that only has, you know, what's it called? Responsibly sourced coffee. I can't think of the free trade. Is that what it's called? Free trade coffee.
Fair trade, yeah. Fair
trade coffee. So he talks about ways that people use Bonhoeffer in that regard. And so I think, to answer your question more directly, the Bonhoeffer today is like, that's a complicated question. And I know Peter and I've had some email exchange about this, that there are varying interpretations of Bonhoeffer. And some of them are within the sort of boundaries, I maybe said this last week, or within the boundaries of reasonable disagreement. You know, not everybody has to agree on how to interpret certain things. And some of them are outside those bounds, where I think they're misappropriations or co-opting Bonhoeffer for other purposes that are problematic. So
he wrote something on a blog or something, your Bonhoeffer moment. Is that right?
So I wrote, yeah. So I have it. Oh, Steve, does that Steve Haynes?
I think so.
So there's a question out there. Is this a Bonhoeffer moment that's been sort of in the popular discourse for a few years? Steve has a couple, I think has at least one or two essays out there on is this a Bonhoeffer moment. I published a piece on that, which is in the bibliography with Reggie Williams, the author of Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. We published that in Sojourners a couple of years ago. But again, it's an interesting history. So is this a Bonhoeffer moment question was put into the public discourse by Eric Metaxas at the 2013 National Prayer Breakfast. He was asked to speak, and he was raising the question in light of the Supreme Court case around marriage equality. And so for the conservative evangelical Christians, they were saying this was a Bonhoeffer moment, that this was they were saying it was a status confessionis, that they could not abide by the thought of marriage equality for the LGBTQ community, and that they had to act, they had to write their representatives, they had to do something because it was going to compromise their understanding of the gospel. So that's how it got put out there. And then other Bonhoeffer scholars said, we actually would like to reinterpret that because we actually disagree with that particular thinking about the Bonhoeffer moment. So Steve wrote a piece, and then Reggie and I had been asked to speak at a conference called the Summit for Change, where we did a keynote panel on that question, but one of the sort of sub questions was, does it call for violence? And this was after Trump had been elected. Of course, that's a really dangerous question, right? If you're saying, is this the Bonhoeffer moment? And Bonhoeffer's known for his role in a conspiracy that was aiming to assassinate someone. So part of what Reggie and I were trying to do was reinterpret the question. And so we were like, we were able to say that we think the right question is, how does Bonhoeffer encourage us to ask, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And that question is helpful. I have actually reinterpreted that question for my students. So I have students from lots of different religious traditions. Not all of my students are Christian by a pretty wide margin at this point. And so I think if that question is a little bit troubling for non-Christian students, I think you can still read Bonhoeffer and ask the question, who is suffering today, right? So we go back to that other question, and that gives us a lens for sort of saying, how do we then respond to the other? How do you respond to the other out of your own tradition if it's not a Christian tradition? What is our relationship with neighbor, and how do we open up that question? So yeah, so you can see that sort of track that, is this a Bonhoeffer moment question, and trying to sort of understand it in our times without, you can't take Bonhoeffer's life and kind of just use it as a template on another context. You have to do the work of understanding your own context and seeing how it applies.
I do see there's a couple. John has got a lot of thinking going on there.
Oh, okay,
I was going to say, so if we can address that one, I realize, folks, that we're a little past time. So if you have to leave, that is fine. Otherwise, let's address this last one for now, and then go from there.
Yeah, so the last question, could Christian churches and leaders be a catalyst in getting conservative and liberal Christians to interact in a truthful, albeit difficult manner? I mean, my initial answer to that is absolutely yes. My second response is, but I don't know how exactly, right? That's the $1 million question, is what does that look like?
Your relationship.
And I think you're right. I think it's through and partly through individual relationships. So so for me personally, I recognize that sometimes I post things on my social media, in public kind of ways to kind of spur some thought, but that's not always the most effective way. And so what I'm finding is that I'm having conversations with individuals who are, and again, you have to kind of start a little bit in the middle. People who are so far opposed to you, that's how everybody's kind of in their lane, and it's hard to get that conversation started. But people who are having questions, raising questions. So I've got several ongoing conversations right now with friends who are like, I'm having a lot of, I'm rethinking a lot of things that I always thought were the case, and I could use some help. And so we're sort of going down some of these conversational paths together. And it's been really, it's been good for me too, to kind of hear those real heartfelt concerns and worries, and how do you sort of give up some things that you held to be true, and how do you meet in the middle? And so yeah, I think Peter, I think you're right. I think relationship is really
well, and language is so important as well. Getting away from the they, them, theirs, that othering language is so critical, and it's hard to keep yourself in check, especially when you think you're in a group of people that have the same thought as you, which is where we tend to hang out more so than ever. So that's a practice, I think, just on our own, even when you're talking among people who have similar thoughts, to work on keeping each other in check, of not using that language when you're talking about a subject matter and talking about your personal experience and thought, and how that relates to where you are at, without demonizing. And that's a practice that maybe is easier to try to start with people of same thought, keeping each other accountable, so that when you get in a group with someone who does have a different viewpoint that you can be a listener and not fall into the use of that dividing language.
Exactly. And I absolutely agree with that. And at the same time, I want to say it is okay or even necessary to recognize that if some people have views that are dehumanizing to other groups of people, it's okay to say, I can't abide that. So like this, I agree to disagree. You know, you can agree to disagree about whether pineapple should be on pizza, but I think it should not. But that's, you know, that's my view, and we can agree to disagree on that. But if you generally, anybody holds racist views, then I don't think we can agree to disagree on certain kind of views. But then how do you invite people into the conversation in a constructive, loving way? I mean, it's hard, but
even right. And in that point, rather than being accusatory and calling them a racist and name calling, say, that's really made me uncomfortable because this is where I value, you know, people in this light. What you said is uncomfortable and I don't understand it. You know, so it is a lot of language because you can inflame it, you can kind of bring it down. So unfortunately, folks, I think we have to go today. Lori, this has been fabulous. Pastor Peter, do you want to just kind of, yeah, thank you so much. And do you want to just kind of give a little hint of what Andy Root is going to do next week in regards to Bonhoeffer?
Yeah, I think we're gonna keep talking a little bit about kind of what discipleship means, and I think still really digging more into this idea of kind of incarnational theology from the viewpoint of others, and how do we kind of connect some of those dots. So he's got some really interesting things. Obviously, Lori is, you know, these are just conversations that I think we really do need to have, and to have a variety of people to help think and imagine and kind of be partners together right now. So we'll look forward to having Lori back sometime in person to go going deeper.
Yes, and everybody can think about who is Jesus Christ for us today. There's the big question.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lori. It was quite a gift. Thank you.
See you next week.
Bye, folks.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, Lori.
Happy birthday.
Good job and happy birthday.
Thank you.